Let me tell you about loyalty. Real loyalty. The kind that doesn't ask questions, that shows up at 5:30 every morning, rain or shine, that waits in parking lots and knows exactly how someone takes their coffee after the first week. For 17 years, I gave that loyalty to a man named Leonard Hartwick. 17 years of my life, driving him from one corner of the city to another, watching him through the rearview mirror, learning his silences, his moods, the way he'd tap his fingers against his briefcase when he was working through a problem. People always ask what it's like working for a billionaire. They imagine champagne wishes and caviar dreams, private jets and Hollywood excess. But Leonard wasn't like that. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of wealthy that doesn't announce itself with gold watches and loud restaurants. He wore the same rotation of 7 suits, I'd counted, each one perfectly tailored but unremarkable. Navy, charcoal, black. He carried a leather briefcase that was older than my marriage, scratched and worn at the corners. And he was punctual to a fault, which meant I had to be too. I suppose I should tell you about myself, shouldn't I? My name is James, though Leonard always called me by my last name, Morrison. I'm 63 years old now. With a bad knee and reading glasses I'm too vain to wear in public. I've got a wife, Patricia, who quilts and complains about my long hours, and 2 grown daughters who think I should have retired 5 years ago. But driving wasn't just a job to me. It was a calling in a way. There's something profound about being trusted with someone's time, their safety, their private moments between destinations. Leonard Hartwick owned 17 companies. 17. Everything from medical supply manufacturing to a chain of bookstores he refused to make profitable, keeping them open out of what I can only describe as stubborn nostalgia. He never talked business with me directly, but I overheard things. You'd be amazed what people forget about the driver. I became part of the car's upholstery after a while, invisible and essential all at once. Our routine was sacred. Every morning, I'd pull up to his townhouse at exactly 6 o'clock. Not the mansion in the suburbs where his wife lived. They'd been separated for years, though never divorced, but a modest brownstone in the old quarter, tucked between a bakery and a bookshop. He'd emerge at 6:03, never earlier, never later, carrying that ancient briefcase and a thermos of coffee his housekeeper prepared. We'd drive to his main office downtown, arriving at 6:45. He'd work until 7 in the evening, sometimes 8. Then I'd drive him home. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, we'd stop at the public library. Saturday mornings, the art museum. Sundays, he stayed home. For 17 years, this was my life. And I was content with it, truly. There's a comfort in knowing what each day will bring, in being excellent at something simple. Patricia used to say I talked about Leonard like he was family, and maybe she was right. You spend that much time with someone, watching them age, watching silver creep into their hair at the temples, watching them sigh over phone calls they think you can't hear. You develop a connection, even if it's unspoken. He was kind to me in his way. He remembered my birthday every year with a bonus that made Patricia cry the first time. When my youngest daughter got married, he gave her a check that paid for half the wedding, handed it to me in an envelope with just my name written on it in his precise handwriting. He never missed asking about my family, though he rarely shared anything about his own. I knew he had a son somewhere, estranged. I knew his wife, Margaret, stayed in the suburbs seeing her own friends, living her own life. I knew he was lonely, though he'd never say it. I thought I knew him. God, I really did. I knew he took his coffee black with 1 sugar. I knew he rubbed his left temple when he had a headache. I knew he dog-eared pages in books instead of using bookmarks, a habit that drove his assistant crazy. I knew he donated anonymously to the Children's Hospital every Christmas, always exactly the same amount. I knew he hummed sometimes, old jazz standards under his breath, when he thought no one was listening. But knowing someone's habits isn't the same as knowing them, is it? That's what I learned. You can catalog a person's entire routine, map their days like geography, and still miss the essential truth of who they are. You can sit 3 feet away from someone for 17 years and never see them clearly. It was a Tuesday when everything changed. Of course it was a Tuesday. Isn't that how these things always happen? Not on dramatic Fridays or contemplative Sundays. But on ordinary Tuesdays, when you're expecting nothing more than the usual rhythm of a day you've lived 1,000 times before, the morning started like any other. Patricia made me scrambled eggs with too much pepper, the way she's done for 40 years, and I left the house at 5:15 to pick up the car from the garage. The Mercedes was immaculate, as always. I took pride in that. Leonard never asked me to keep it spotless, but I did anyway. It's the small dignities that matter in a service position, the things you do because they reflect on you, not because someone's watching. I pulled up to the brownstone at exactly 6 o'clock. The morning was cold, one of those late autumn days where the chill gets into your bones and stays there. The bakery next door was just opening, and the smell of fresh bread drifted through the car vents. I waited, watching the building's entrance, expecting to see Leonard emerge at 6:03 with his briefcase and thermos. 6:03 came and went. Then 6:04. 6:05. In 17 years, Leonard had been late exactly twice. Once when he had the flu so badly his housekeeper called me to cancel the day. Once when there was a gas leak in the building and everyone had to evacuate. This was unprecedented, and I felt anxiety creeping up my spine. I checked my phone, no messages. I waited another minute, then 2. At 6:08, I called his cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voice, formal and distant. "You've reached Leonard Hartwick. Please leave a message." I hung up without speaking. I called his home line. No answer. By 6:15, I was genuinely worried. Leonard was 74 years old, and while he was in good health, things happen. I imagined him collapsed on his bathroom floor, a stroke or heart attack, lying there alone while I sat outside like an idiot checking my watch. The housekeeper didn't live in, she arrived at 8, so there'd be no one to help him. I made a decision then that would change everything. I got out of the car and approached the building. I'd never been inside Leonard's home in all these years. He'd always come out to meet me, maintaining that professional boundary. But this was different. This was an emergency, potentially. The building's main door was unlocked. It always was during the day. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, my knee protesting each step, and found Leonard's unit, 3B. I knocked firmly. "Mr. Hartwick." "It's Morrison." "Sir, are you all right?" Nothing. Silence that felt heavy, ominous. I knocked again, harder this time. "Mr. Hartwick, I'm concerned about you. If you don't answer, I'm going to call for emergency services." Still nothing. I tried the doorknob, not expecting it to turn, but it did. The door swung open into a narrow hallway, and my heart was pounding now, adrenaline and fear mixing into something sharp and urgent. "Mr. Hartwick." I stepped inside. The apartment was neat, almost sterile. Hardwood floors, minimal furniture, everything in shades of gray and beige. It looked more like a hotel suite than a home. There were no personal photographs, no clutter, nothing that spoke of a life actually being lived here. I moved through the hallway into the main living area. "Mr. Hartwick, it's Morrison. I'm coming in because I'm worried." I stopped dead. He was there, standing by the window, very much alive and healthy. But he wasn't alone. There was a woman sitting on the couch, maybe 60 years old, wearing a hospital gown and slippers. Her hair was thin and gray, and she was staring at nothing, her hands folded in her lap. A younger woman, perhaps 35, stood beside Leonard. She was wearing scrubs and had a medical bag at her feet. Leonard turned to look at me, and the expression on his face wasn't anger or surprise. It was resignation, like a man who'd been expecting this moment for years and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. "Morrison," he said quietly, "I apologize for making you wait. There was a situation this morning." I stood there, completely confused, looking from Leonard to the woman on the couch to the woman in scrubs. "Sir, I was worried. You've never... I called and you didn't answer, and I thought perhaps you'd fallen or..." "I'm fine," he said. "But I think we need to talk. Please, sit down." I didn't move. Couldn't move. Something fundamental had shifted, and I could feel the ground beneath my assumptions beginning to crack. "Sir, I should go. This is clearly a private matter. I'll wait in the car." "No." His voice was firm, and I'd never heard that particular tone from him before. "Please sit down, Morrison. I think it's time you knew the truth." The woman in scrubs moved toward the door. "I'll give you privacy, Mr. Hartwick. Call me if you need anything. Her vitals are stable." She glanced at me with something like sympathy, then left, the door clicking shut behind her. Leonard gestured to a chair. I sat, because what else could I do? My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The woman on the couch hadn't moved or acknowledged my presence at all. She continued staring at nothing, her breathing slow and steady. "Morrison," Leonard began, and for the first time in 17 years, I heard his voice shake. "The woman sitting there is Sarah. She's my wife. My real wife." I blinked, confused. "But sir, your wife is Margaret. She lives in the—" "Margaret is my sister," he interrupted. "She's been pretending to be my wife for 30 years. Sarah is my actual wife, and she has advanced Alzheimer's. She's been living here with me since her diagnosis 12 years ago." The words didn't make sense. I heard them, but they didn't connect to anything I understood about reality. I don't understand." "I know." He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, suddenly looking every one of his 74 years. "Let me tell you a story, Morrison. A true story about who I really am, and why I've spent 3 decades living a lie." "Her name was Sarah Atwater," Leonard began, and his voice had changed. It was softer now, vulnerable in a way I'd never heard. "We met when we were both 23 years old, working at the same accounting firm in Pittsburgh. I was ambitious, hungry, determined to make something of myself. She was— God, Morrison, she was everything. Brilliant and funny and kind. She had this laugh that made everyone around her smile. She could talk to anyone, make them feel seen. I was nothing special, but somehow she chose me." The woman on the couch, Sarah, made a small sound, a soft murmur. Leonard's eyes flicked to her, filled with such tenderness it made my chest ache. "We got married at 25. Small wedding, just family and a few friends. We couldn't afford much, but we didn't care. We were building a life together, and that was enough. I started my first company when I was 28. Medical supplies, like you know. Sarah helped me with everything. She wasn't an employee. She was my partner. Every decision, every risk, every late night hunched over spreadsheets, we did it together. When the company took off, when the money started coming in, none of it mattered except that we had each other." He paused, rubbing his temples. I sat frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. We wanted children, but it never happened for us. Sarah had 3 miscarriages. Each one broke us a little more. We tried adoption, but in those days the process was complicated. We eventually accepted it would just be the 2 of us, and we made peace with that. We had our work, our friends, our life. It was a good life, Morrison. We were happy. Then what happened? I asked quietly, though part of me didn't want to know, wanted to preserve the simple understanding I'd had of the world just 30 minutes earlier. "Robert happened," Leonard said, and his voice went hard. "My business partner. My best friend since college. I trusted him completely. Sarah and we socialized with him and his wife constantly. Vacations together, holidays, everything. He was like family. I could see where this was going, and my stomach dropped. When Sarah was 41, she started forgetting things. Small things at first, where she'd put her keys, whether she'd had lunch. We joked about it, called it stress. But it got worse. Much worse. By the time she was 43, we had a diagnosis. Early onset Alzheimer's. The doctor said she'd probably have 10 to 15 years, maybe less. She'd need full-time care eventually. Would lose all memory of who she was, who I was. Everything. Sarah murmured again, and Leonard stood, going to her. He knelt beside the couch and took her hand, speaking softly. "It's all right, sweetheart. You're safe. I'm here." She didn't respond, didn't seem to recognize him, but she quieted at his touch. He stayed there for a moment before returning to his chair. I was devastated, obviously, but I was determined to take care of her, to give her the best life possible for whatever time we had left. I hired the best doctors, nurses, caregivers. I rearranged my entire life around her needs. And Robert knew all of this. I confided everything in him. Leonard's hands were shaking now. 3 months after her diagnosis, Robert called an emergency board meeting. I thought something had happened with the company. Instead, he and 2 other board members, people I'd brought in, people I trusted, presented a motion to remove me from my position. Their argument was that I was distracted, emotionally compromised, unable to lead effectively. They said having a CEO whose wife was suffering from dementia would hurt investor confidence. They wanted me out. That's unconscionable, I breathed. Could they even do that? They had the votes. I'd been so focused on Sarah that I hadn't noticed Robert carefully positioning himself, making alliances, preparing for this. He'd wanted my position for years, and saw Sarah's illness as his opportunity. The bastard even had the audacity to frame it as doing me a favor, saying I needed to focus on family. What did you do? Leonard smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. I fought. I fought dirty. I had enough shares that they couldn't simply vote me out without my cooperation, and I wasn't about to hand over my company to someone who'd betrayed me like that. But the battle became public. The press got wind of it, probably leaked by Robert's people, and suddenly Sarah's condition was front-page news. Reporters were calling our house, showing up at doctor's appointments, trying to photograph her. It was brutal. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. Sarah was still lucid enough to understand what was happening. She was humiliated, terrified. Having her private medical information discussed in newspapers, having strangers know the most intimate details of her deterioration, it destroyed what little peace she had left. I watched her shrink into herself, watched the stress accelerate her decline. The woman I loved was being torn apart by public scrutiny, and it was my fault for not protecting her. That's not your fault, I said. They did that to her. Robert and the others. Maybe. But I couldn't undo it. I couldn't give her back her privacy or dignity. So I made a decision. I would give her both, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. The pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they formed was staggering. The separation, I said. Margaret pretending to be your wife. You were hiding Sarah. Yes. I told Margaret everything. She's always been protective of me, and she loved Sarah like a sister. She agreed immediately to help. We announced that Sarah and I were separating, that she was moving away to deal with her illness privately, and that the stress had caused an irreparable rift in our marriage. We made it as boring and sad as possible, the kind of story the press loses interest in quickly. Meanwhile, I bought this building under a shell company, moved Sarah here with round-the-clock care, and continued my life as if I were a separated man slowly working toward divorce. And Margaret played the role of your wife in public. She attended events with me, moved into the suburban house to maintain appearances. We let people draw their own conclusions about the timeline, never correcting them. Over time, the narrative became that Margaret and I had been married for decades, that Sarah was an unfortunate first marriage that ended sadly. It's amazing what people will believe if you don't contradict them, especially when they're not particularly interested in your personal life anyway. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed. For 30 years. You've been living this double life for 30 years. Yes. And it worked, Morrison. I was able to protect Sarah's privacy, give her a peaceful environment without media intrusion. I won the battle with Robert. It took 3 years of legal warfare, but I kept my company. And I got to stay with Sarah, care for her, be her husband even though she eventually forgot who I was. The son, I said suddenly. You mentioned you had a son. Leonard's face darkened. Michael. He was Robert's son, actually. Robert and his wife had him late in life. When everything exploded with the company, Michael took his father's side. He was 22, idealistic, convinced I was the villain. We haven't spoken in 28 years. He changed his name, refuses any contact. That's the other thing I lost. The boy I'd thought of as a nephew, someone I loved. We sat in silence for a long moment. I looked at Sarah, this woman I'd never known existed, who'd been living 3 floors above me every time I waited on the street. Leonard's entire life, the truth of who he was, had been happening in a place I'd never thought to look. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. "After all these years, why reveal it today?" Leonard rubbed his face tiredly. "Because Sarah had a bad episode this morning. Sometimes she gets agitated, confused, and nothing the nurses do helps. She was calling for me, not by name, she doesn't remember my name anymore, but she was distressed and I couldn't leave her. I should have called you, should have sent a message, but I wasn't thinking clearly. And when you came upstairs, when you saw, I realized I was tired of hiding. At least from you." "The Tuesday evenings at the library," I said, understanding flooding through me. "Thursday evenings too." "You weren't at the library." "No. I was here with Sarah. The nurses have Tuesdays and Thursdays off. I take care of her those evenings myself. Read to her. Play her favorite music, sit with her. She doesn't know who I am, but she seems calmer when I'm here. The library was just an excuse, a place I told my assistant I'd be, somewhere reasonable that no one would question." "And Saturday mornings?" "The art museum." "Actually, I do go to the museum. Sarah and I used to go every Saturday when we were young. I walk through the same galleries we walk through together, look at the same paintings. It's my way of keeping her memory alive, the real her, the woman she was before this disease took her from me." I felt tears pricking my eyes, which surprised me. I'm not an emotional man, usually. But the weight of what Leonard had carried alone for 3 decades, the devotion and sacrifice, the way he'd quietly loved this woman while the world thought he was a cold, divorced businessman, it was overwhelming. "Does anyone else know?" I asked. "Besides Margaret and the medical staff? My lawyer. My accountant. A handful of people who needed to know to maintain the fiction. And now you, Morrison. Now you." Sarah made that murmuring sound again, and Leonard went to her once more. This time he sat beside her on the couch, putting his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him instinctively, seeking comfort without understanding why. He held her like she was precious, like she was the most important thing in his world. Because she was. She always had been. "I don't understand why you hid it from everyone," I said. "I mean, I understand at first protecting her from the media. But after that, after you'd won the company back and the press lost interest, why continue the charade?" Leonard sighed. "Because it wasn't just about the media, Morrison. It was about letting her fade away in peace, without becoming an object of pity. When people know you have a spouse with Alzheimer's, they treat you differently. They ask questions, offer unsolicited advice, want updates. They mean well, but it's exhausting, and it makes the disease the central fact of your existence. I didn't want that for Sarah or for myself. I wanted us to have privacy, normalcy in whatever form we could salvage." "And the business aspect?" "That too," he admitted. "I learned from Robert's betrayal that vulnerability in business is dangerous. If people had known Sarah was still in my life, that I was caring for her daily, they might have seen me as distracted, unfocused, easier to control or push aside. As a divorced man whose first marriage had ended sadly years ago, I was just another wealthy businessman with a complicated past. Unremarkable. That kept me safe and kept my company stable. But the cost," I said quietly. "The loneliness. Never being able to talk about her, acknowledge her, share what you were going through." "The cost was high," Leonard agreed. "There were nights when I thought I'd break from it, from carrying this alone. But then I'd look at Sarah, safe and peaceful in her routine, not afraid or confused by cameras and strangers, and I knew I'd made the right choice. Her comfort mattered more than mine. Her dignity mattered more than my need to be understood. I thought about Patricia, my wife of 40 years. I tried to imagine her getting a diagnosis like Sarah's, tried to imagine making the choices Leonard had made. Would I have the strength? The discipline? I honestly didn't know. "You've given up everything for her," I said. "Your public identity, relationships, any chance at companionship. 30 years of your life." Leonard shook his head. I didn't give up anything, Morrison. I chose her. Every single day for 30 years, I chose her. That's not sacrifice, that's love. This is what it looks like when you love someone completely. You don't keep score, don't measure what you've given up. You just show up, day after day, and do what needs to be done. Sarah turned her head toward him, and for just a moment, her eyes seemed to focus on his face. "Do I know you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Yes, sweetheart," Leonard said gently. "You know me. We've known each other a very long time." "That's nice," she said, and then the awareness faded again, her eyes going distant. Leonard kissed her forehead, and I had to look away from the intimacy of it, the profound tenderness. In all my years of marriage, all my years of working for Leonard, I'd never witnessed anything quite so pure as that moment. A man loving a woman who couldn't remember his name, loving her anyway with his whole heart. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now that I know." "That depends on you," Leonard said, looking at me directly. "I'm trusting you, Morrison. Trusting you with the most important secret of my life. I've trusted you with my time and safety for 17 years. Now I'm trusting you with this. Can you keep it?" "Of course," I said immediately. "Sir, I would never." "I know," he interrupted. "I knew before I told you. That's why I told you. But it changes things between us. You'll know where I really am on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. You'll know why I sometimes seem distracted, or why I might need to cancel unexpectedly. You'll know the truth behind the facade." "I'm honored that you trust me with this," I said. "And sir, if there's ever anything I can do to help, anything at all, you only need to ask." Leonard smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. "You've already helped, Morrison. More than you know. Your reliability, your discretion, your simple kindness over the years. It's made this life possible. You've been steady when everything else was chaos. That matters. You matter." I felt something shift in my chest, a reordering of my understanding of these 17 years. I hadn't just been a driver. I'd been part of something larger, a conspiracy of care, protecting something precious even without knowing it. "We should go," Leonard said, checking his watch. "We're late for the office, and I have a 9 o'clock meeting I can't miss. The nurse will be here in an hour to stay with Sarah." That Tuesday changed everything and nothing. We still followed our routine. The same routes, the same schedule, the same comfortable silence. But now I understood what I was looking at when I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man I'd thought was cold and distant was actually someone carrying the weight of a great love. Someone who'd built his entire life around protecting one person's peace and dignity. The Tuesdays and Thursdays when Leonard said he'd be at the library, I now waited outside the brownstone instead, understanding where he truly was. Sometimes I'd see him at the window, looking out at the street, and we'd exchange a small nod, acknowledgement of our shared secret. Sometimes his sister Margaret would arrive for visits, and I'd watch her hurry inside, this woman who'd given up 30 years of her own privacy to help her brother maintain his fiction. I never told Patricia the full truth. It wasn't my story to share, and Leonard had trusted me with something sacred. But I told her enough, that I'd learned my employer was a better man than I'd realized, that he'd made sacrifices most people couldn't imagine. She understood there was more I couldn't say, and she didn't press. After 40 years of marriage, she knew when to let silence be enough. Over the next few years, I watched Leonard age in ways that went beyond the physical. There was a weariness in him, a bone-deep exhaustion that comes from decades of vigilance. Sarah was declining more rapidly. The nurses reported more bad episodes, more days where she didn't recognize anything or anyone. Leonard stopped going to the office on Fridays, spending those days with her instead. I'd drop him off Thursday evening and not see him again until Monday morning. "She's getting close to the end," he told me one Monday, climbing into the car with red-rimmed eyes. "The doctors say maybe 6 months, maybe less. Her heart is weakening." "I'm so sorry, sir," I said, and meant it with my whole heart. "Don't be sorry," he said. "She's been fighting this disease for 42 years. That's longer than anyone expected. She's tired, Morrison. It's time to let her rest." That Friday, I drove Leonard home at noon instead of the usual time. He'd canceled all his afternoon meetings. "Stay with me for a moment," he said when we arrived at the brownstone. "Please." We went upstairs together. Sarah was in bed now, too weak to sit on the couch anymore. The nurse had set up a hospital bed in the living room, surrounded by flowers and photographs from Sarah and Leonard's early years together. Evidence of the life she couldn't remember but that Leonard was determined to keep present. "I want you to meet her," Leonard said. "Properly. While she's still here." We approached the bed. Sarah was sleeping, her breathing shallow and raspy. Leonard took her hand and spoke softly. "Sarah. Sweetheart, someone's here. Someone I want you to meet." Her eyes fluttered open, cloudy and unfocused. Leonard gestured for me to come closer. "This is Morrison," he said to Sarah. "He's been very kind to me for many years. He's a good man, and I wanted him to meet you." Sarah looked at me without recognition, but she smiled slightly. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, Mrs. Hartwick," I said, my voice thick. "It's an honor to meet you." She turned her attention back to Leonard. "Do I know you?" "Yes, my love. You've always known me, even when you didn't know my name. And I've always known you." "That's nice," she murmured and closed her eyes again. Leonard stood there holding her hand, and I stood beside him, bearing witness to a love that had endured everything: betrayal, disease, time, memory loss. A love that persisted not because it was remembered, but because one person had chosen every single day to keep showing up. "Thank you for being here," Leonard said quietly. "For seeing her. For knowing she existed." "Thank you for showing me," I replied. "For trusting me with her story." Sarah passed away 6 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning with Leonard beside her. The obituary was brief and listed her as Sarah Hartwick, divorced wife of Leonard Hartwick, succumbed to a long illness. Only a handful of people attended her funeral: Margaret, the longtime nurses, Leonard's lawyer, and me. Leonard had asked me to be there, and I went in my capacity not as his driver, but as someone who'd been allowed to witness the truth. Leonard scattered her ashes at the art museum, in the sculpture garden they'd loved when they were young. He did it early one morning before the museum opened, with special permission from the director. I drove him there and waited while he said his private goodbye to the woman who'd been the center of his entire adult life. Afterward, he was quieter than usual. Not sad, exactly. More like someone who'd been carrying an enormous weight for so long that he didn't quite know what to do with his arms now that it was gone. "What will you do now?" I asked him as we drove back. "Will you tell people the truth?" He shook his head. "No. What would be the point? Sarah is gone. The truth won't bring her back or change anything that happened. Let people remember me as they do, a divorced businessman who had a complicated first marriage. Sarah's dignity is protected, and that's all that matters. And Margaret. She'll continue being my wife for public events, though less frequently now that I'm planning to step back from some of my business ventures. We've earned some quiet, both of us." He looked out the window at the city passing by. "You know what I've learned, Morrison? The things that matter most in life are the things we do when no one's watching. The quiet acts of devotion, the faithfulness no one applauds. Sarah never knew, in the end, everything I did for her. She couldn't appreciate the sacrifice or tell me it was worth it. But it was worth it anyway, because love isn't about getting credit or recognition. It's about showing up day after day, simply because someone needs you to." I thought about that a lot in the years that followed. Leonard continued his routine, though without the Tuesday and Thursday library excuses. He worked normal hours now, went home to his empty brownstone. Margaret visited him regularly, and slowly, very slowly, he began allowing himself small pleasures he denied himself for decades. He joined a book club. He traveled, just short trips, to places he and Sarah had always wanted to see together. I retired 2 years after Sarah's death. Leonard threw me a small party at his office, made a generous speech about my years of service, and gave me a retirement gift that let Patricia and I buy the little beach house she'd always dreamed of. On my last day, he pulled me aside. "Thank you, Morrison," he said. "For everything. For your loyalty, your discretion, your presence. For seeing me, and for seeing Sarah. For bearing witness to our story. "It was an honor, sir," I told him. "Truly." He shook my hand and I saw tears in his eyes, the first tears I'd ever seen from him. "I think she would have liked you," he said. "Sarah, I mean. She always appreciated good people, and you're one of the best." That was 7 years ago now. Leonard is 83 years old, finally retired himself. He calls me occasionally, just to chat, to ask about Patricia and my daughters and the grandchildren. We've become something like friends, I suppose, bonded by the secret we still keep. I think about him sometimes, about the man I thought I knew and the man he actually was. How we can sit beside someone for years and still be surprised by the depths of their character. How the most profound acts of love often happen in private, away from applause or acknowledgement. People ask me sometimes what it was like driving for a billionaire all those years. They expect stories of excess and extravagance, of the absurd lives of the wealthy. And I never know quite what to tell them, because the truth is stranger and more beautiful than any story about money or power. I drove a man who loved his wife so completely that he rebuilt his entire existence to protect her, who chose devotion over recognition, privacy over truth, lonely nights over the comfort of sharing his burden, who showed up every day for 42 years to sit beside a woman who didn't remember his name, who told her, "You know me," even when she didn't, who loved her with his whole heart until her very last breath. That's what it was like. And if I could go back and choose again, knowing everything I know now, I'd make the same choice, to be trusted with that story, to witness that kind of love, to understand what it really means when someone promises, for better or worse, in sickness and health. Because some secrets aren't kept to deceive. Some secrets are kept to protect what's most precious in this world. The simple, profound act of one person loving another, steadily and faithfully, even when the whole world has forgotten to watch. That's the man I knew. That's the story I carry. And I'm honored, truly honored, that Leonard Hartwick trusted me enough to share it.